The new Ontario Liberal slogan is "Safe Hands and a Steady Balance." The opposition parties have suggested those safe hands also signed off on $1 billion down the drain thanks to the cancellation of the Oakville and Mississauga gas plants. Unlike two other female premiers in Alberta and Newfoundland whose parties did not support the leader, Kathleen Wynne's party appears steadfastly behind her. But has Premier Wynne really rid herself of the errors of her predecessor once and for all? Joining us now for their perspective, Cyria Grell, former Deputy Communications Director for Premier Wynne, now Vice President at Pilot PMR. John McAtishan, former advisor to Premier Mike Harris, now President of the Bradgate Research Group. And we welcome Frances Lankin, former NDP Cabinet Minister, now Corporate Director at the Institute of Corporate Directors and the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Corporation. Welcome back to you two. Nice to see you again.
It's nice to be back.
Long time since you've been here.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the events of the last 24 hours, where it has emerged that the Ontario Provincial Police are apparently investigating the former Chief of Staff to former Premier Dalton McGuinty as it relates to thousands of potentially, the allegations are potentially erased emails related to the gas plant cancellations. This had been a pretty good week for the Liberals leading up to that announcement. How does this change things? Siri.
I think, to me, the gas plant situation has always been, obviously it's a bad thing and it's bad for the Liberal brand. The Premier is not responsible for that. The people who are responsible for that, one of them resigned and his staff went with him, and I think there's good reason for that, as we're seeing today. I think the Premier has led by example since she took over and has changed the way that the government has run. But obviously, it's hard to distance yourself from your own party, and the Premier who came before you. So yeah, obviously it's a serious issue.
John.
I thought it was really instructive when I heard her say it wasn't her, it wasn't her staff, it wasn't her government, and she left out it wasn't her party. So it's getting closer week to her, and I'm a law and order person, so I believe in due process, and I look forward to seeing what happens. Maybe nothing will come of it, or if this is the ultimate undoing, and I would think there would be bigger things it should have been, but if this is the ultimate undoing, then what will be fascinating is it'll be all the Nixon analogies that'll come out of it. I got a chance to go last year to visit a friend in California, and we went through the Nixon Museum, and for everything that happened, it's the cover-up that was worse than the crime.
No, it's the
same thing.
big thing that came out of Watergate. It's not the crime, it's the cover-up.
Absolutely.
Frances.
Well, I think that's an important observation. I would say that what's changed, probably the biggest thing that's changed since coming out of the annual general meeting for the Premier and for her party is the high that they were on. I think there was a sense of elation. I think there was a sense of we're turning the corner. The gas plant scandal is subsiding. It's not wrapped around our neck. The public is moving on and is looking at the Premier and what she's delivering as separate from the former McGuinty government. This brings it right back to the forefront again, although I'm not convinced that it will have sticking power in terms of what it means for Premier Wynne. Siri said it, she is her own person, she has her own approach. And, it's a bit disingenuous. I understand in terms of opposition politics the importance of scoring while you can, but it's a bit disingenuous to say because someone was at the cabinet table, they are personally responsible for that decision. I mean, I've been at the cabinet table. I understand how those decisions get made. I understand sometimes you are front and center and part of something, and sometimes you aren't. And so,
but the assumption is if you're at the table, unless you resigned in protest to whatever decision was made, you're associated with it.
I think you're associated with it. Are you responsible for it? Is it something that you had the same information as the primary actors on? Not necessarily. It's not always open and transparent at the table either.
The allegations, if I can just jump in, the allegations that have been made too, this is not a party decision. This is not a party doing something. These are criminal allegations. If what is said, what's being suggested is true, that's a criminal behavior, and that's not something that can be, governed by party mandates or anything. It's about ethics and morals of specific people who probably shouldn't be at those tables, right? It's not about a party.
But to be fair, trying to separate party and people, that's a little bit fallacious too, because the reality is there's no such thing called the party. The party is people.
That's right, but
and we all know that it's leaders and
no one would suggest that Ford's
staffs.
criminal behavior is a conservative problem, right? That's a
Right.
problem with that man.
Yeah.
I think these allegations are a problem with some specific people who probably didn't have the moral compasses they needed to be in those positions. I don't think that's a Liberal issue. I think that's an individual issue.
Well, it will certainly be, there will be an attempt to make that a Liberal issue. But I just look at Nigel Wright and Duffy and the attempt to wrap that around the neck of the Prime Minister and the distance that's been created there. So the fact that it's moved to a potential exploration of criminal charges and criminal activity in some way takes it to a different level that you can't say someone who was sitting at the cabinet table was responsible for.
And Nigel Wright was Stephen Harper's chief of staff, right? That happened under Harper's watch. This is Premier Wynne coming in because a premier resigned over this issue, because his staff has left, because there was a leadership review, and she won, and she brought in a new government. To say that was something that she had to do is was brought in to replace the people who caused that problem.
And I agree with everything you just said, and I'm sure those historians who covered Gerald Ford would say, and that's why he didn't win, because, oh yeah, the voters don't make that distinction.
Yeah.
If it sticks, it's going to be the Liberal brand, like it or not, for the foreseeable future.
I just think it's a shame, right, that
Yep.
someone as talented as her has to wear the mistakes of that group of people.
I agree. She's got enough mistakes of her own.
There will be the opportunity to assess those mistakes, and I think that there are. Those opportunities will come. Yeah. But the last thing I want to say about this is, and you're right, if it sticks, the public won't make a distinction. No. But the public doesn't make a distinction between this being a Liberal brand or a Tory brand or a New Democrat brand. It is a politician. The thieves and the bandits that are there and ripping us all up.
Yeah.
It is, and I think that continues to devalue that role of public service and elected office. And there are people like who we're talking about who have contributed greatly to that.
There was a comment made yesterday by Lisa MacLeod, who's an Nepean Carleton Conservative MPP for Eastern Ontario, who said, "This is the worst scandal in Ontario history." Could I get your views on how accurate you believe that statement to be? Siri.
I don't really like to compare scandals. I think, are we talking about, you could talk about Ipperwash, you could talk about situations where people died like Walkerton. I don't think that you want to have moral relativism here. It's a serious issue, and I think no one's denying that. Absolutely, the things that are alleged to happen should not have happened. I don't think I want to get into a game where we're saying whose scandals are worse.
I think her yardstick here, part of how she was measuring was she said no chief of staff to any premier has ever been under criminal investigation before. And in her view, that raised it to a
unprecedented
new height.
example,
yeah.
Sure.
He's not currently the chief of staff, I would say that. But yeah, that could well be true.
Worst scandal ever?
It's so hard to tell. I mean, a lot of it's the moment, right? And to her credit, she's a partisan in the right place at the right time, trying to get as much media attention as possible. I don't know that it is. I don't know that it's not. I want to, to me right now, it's an investigation.
Yeah.
From a political point of view, Francis, I think one of the interesting things about it is that the Conservatives have set their attacks as much on the New Democrats as they have the Liberals. They have certainly said the Liberals no longer have the moral authority to govern. But they have also said, how can you New Democrats, not you, but how can that party continue to allow the Liberals to survive? Meaning it's incumbent upon Andrea Horwath at her first opportunity to pull the plug on these guys and have an election. What do you think of that attack?
I think it's a stupid attack, actually. I think it's really stupid. I don't think the public actually want an election. I think Andrea has to gauge that sense of public opinion. I think she has shown in the past that she's willing to set some hard lines, and she's been able to accomplish a number of things that move the agenda, the progressive agenda forward that she represents and that she believes she and her members were elected for. I don't think that flies. I think that sounds like just such typical spin. And whoever it came from, it's not that it's just Tory. Yeah, I know, but it's not just Tory spin. It sounds like such typical spin. I don't think that the public gives that a lot of credence. So I don't think it's working.
If I could jump in, if I stay away from the negative and just deal with positives. If I look at what's in the NDP's best interest, it would be to give this investigation enough time. I think, if anything, there's a solid reason now to say, whoa, we're not rushing into an election where people can say, hey, it wasn't me, nobody I know, met the guy once. What will happen is a thorough police investigation and either no charges or charges, and then that becomes more fascinating. Now, we won't, by the end of this mandate, if there are charges, get to a legal case. But the charges, if I was the leader of the NDP, I'd prefer going into an election with a set of charges against the Liberal Premier's office as opposed to an investigation. Yeah.
Siri, I just want you to help us understand, since you know some of the players here. 8 days ago, the Liberal Party had an event at the Metro Convention Centre in Toronto where they raised $3 million in one night in a packed hall, I think 2,000 people plus in the hall that night. Then they had their annual general meeting a couple of days later, and it was lots of sis boom ba, lots of good feeling in the room. The Premier she tossed a lot of red meat to the crowd and gave a partisan macho, even by her standards, a macho speech. Stephen Harper, if you're not going to help, get out of the way, a lot of that. And now this. What does that do to the mood of the troops?
Well, I think when you think about what the troops have been through for the last, couple of years, these are really hardworking people. They've been through a lot. She got a government up and running in about 3 weeks. She went through putting a throne speech out, putting a budget out. They had by-elections. It's been a long year and a half. So yeah, I think people are tired and they don't need this sort of a kick.
Does this kill morale?
I don't think so, because I think that people in there can differentiate between these two things, right? That the people they know better than anyone, the people who are responsible for these decisions, the people who brought us the gas plant, are no longer in government. And they're no longer in the Premier's office. And so the group of people who are in there now, they believe in Kathleen, they believe in what she's doing, they believe in the approach she's taking, obviously, as you saw on the floor there. And so I think that the fact that some people who are no longer around did some bad things, perhaps worse than we thought, it doesn't really reflect, because it's not her, it's not what she's doing, and it's not the way she's running things.
John, you've done your share of polling over the years, and I want to ask you about the last number of polls, actually, which have all essentially said the same thing. Liberals 36, PCs 33, New Democrats 25, Greens at 7. This is Nick Nanos's Ontario provincial tracking. As a guy who's done a lot of polling, tell us, beyond the obvious, what those numbers say to you.
The problem is it's the problem with media dealing with polls, right? It's a statistical tie, it's a horse race, so it means anybody could win. I'm as equally convinced that any one of the parties could win the next election at this point in time, and have been of that opinion for some time now. The numbers that are more important are the ones that go deeper and deeper below that into why, the depth of support, what the second choices are, and will people show up? So in the case of the Liberals, you asked about the implication of the damage, right? And to me, it's like, well, right now it's more air coming out of the balloon as opposed to a pinprick. But the number one dynamic for the last 25 years in Ontario elections has been turnout of the governing party. So, the NDP, with all due respect, they got elected. And then people said, yeah, I remember voting NDP, and not. And then 2003, it was our turn. And, well, frankly, I guess in '87, it was the Liberals' turn, right? So this time up, this is the last government, right? And the biggest dynamic, there's two opportunities. One is for Conservatives to come home, and we haven't seen a lot of that, but some, and for NDP to increase their support, which they've done in the last 3 elections. If Liberals get unhappy, if they are the ones who start to say, I'm not comfortable, I can't hold my nose this time, and I actually am more unhappy with my people than disliking the other guys, and just sit home. It was only, a couple 100,000 votes between the Liberals and Conservatives in the last election. Yeah. There's the whole
2 points.
There's the whole game right there, unless it's a breakthrough for the NDP, because the Liberal vote actually collapses. And that's what I'm saying. It could be anything.
And I do think, knowing the Premier and knowing that that's true, I think you should expect a burst of activity from her. I think she will. She believes that she can govern this province and that she can represent her party. And I think she will do everything she can to make sure that doesn't happen, and to show people something different that they can vote for. instead of staying home or instead of saying.
So
it's
you'd be
over.
saying she'd be doing that in the next year and a half, or in the next 60 days?
I think she's been doing it, but I think if I know her at all, I think she's probably planning to be really out and about the next little while.
Francis.
Oh, I'm sure. And she's been out and about constantly since she came in.
Yeah.
And there's got to be a personal fatigue level there that I would worry about on a human level.
I think she might be a robot, so I don't think you have to worry about that.
She is in pretty good shape for a 60-year-old
She
woman.
certainly is. The people who surround her, Siri, I think might be where you're at in terms of they can distinguish, they understand. I think the people, the voters on the ground, the Liberal, troops on the ground, the people that knock on the doors, I think this is a real kick to them.
Yeah.
And I think it's deflating. I think they came out of that AGM feeling, we're ready to go, we've turned the corner, and now here again. And they may direct their anger at the previous administration, but what does it do to their motivation? And I think that that's something that the Liberal Party will have to address if they're going to, turn that around. But it's on a slide down with this momentum right now, and depending on how that investigation unfolds.
And I think
there could be
realistically,
more to come.
she's trying to get a fourth mandate for her party, which is pretty unprecedented, even if everything's going really well. So I don't think anyone's naive to the challenge at hand or what people are facing. I think all she can do and all the party can do is say, we do offer something different. It is, and differentiate themselves from the party. And I think that the energy that you saw at the AGM was her doing that, I think, a lot more explicitly than she's done in the past, is showing what the difference is between her and the kind of government that Tim Hudak would run and the kind of government that Andrew would run. She has to show that difference, and she has to prove that she's the best option.
This has been an unusual week in Canadian politics, particularly in the province of Alberta. And here's what Brenda O'Neill and David Stewart had to write in the Globe and Mail just a few days ago about this. Women party leaders experience significantly shorter tenures than their male counterparts. Among major parties, women's average is 2.4 years. For men, the equivalent figure is 5.3 years. It is rare, but not unheard of, for a male party leader who has won an election not to get a chance to defend his position in the next election. On the other hand, this is the norm for women party leaders. The reference, of course, being to Alison Redford, who just wins a majority government, I guess a year and a half ago or so, less than 2 years ago, and steps down because of internal fighting in her party. Kathy Dunderdale, Newfoundland and Labrador, resigns last January after less than 2 years, or I guess just over 2 years on the job, having won a majority government. We don't know what's going to happen in Quebec, but it certainly doesn't look good right now for the female premier in Quebec. And so people are obviously curious, I suspect, about whether this means anything for the female premier of Ontario. John.
This is one of the best examples of the misuse of statistics that I've ever seen in my life.
Go ahead.
It's on a sample size of how many angels on the head of a pin. I mean, really, we haven't had female premiers in abundance enough with enough time.
Rita Johnson,
to
Kim
come
Campbell, Catherine Callback, they've all had the same experience.
It's such a smaller pool, you can't draw those
It is.
statistics
No,
from.
and there's the second dynamic, which is something that I'm going to, I was actually still astonished. I looked at the numbers in the House of Commons at what a small percentage women still are in our national parliament. There is still a long way to go before we get to women representing the 52% of the population that they are.
Yes.
So there's no one's talked about it in a long time, about the glass ceiling or about the boys' club.
Lots of people talk about it. Equal Voice is an
I'm
incredible
saying
leadership organization.
I would
on
suggest
this.
that not in most of these cases, the examples weren't women who broke the glass ceiling, but climbed over the glass ceiling.
I think the thing is women fail and succeed at things just like men do. We had a male finance minister resign recently. We're not reassessing male finance ministers, as far as I know.
Well, that's not analogous. It's not analogous.
Well, why not?
Because he was the only finance minister Stephen Harper had. He had the job for a very long time by historic standards.
Right. I don't understand why Alison, and maybe, I'd like to hear your perspective on this, because you mentioned before we came on that you were concerned about the way that Alison Redford went out. I don't understand why it's necessarily a gender issue. She's the leader of her party, she's the premier of her province, and she wears the things that the people in those roles wear. I don't understand why it has to be a debate about the sisterhood or about feminism or about women's abilities. It's about the fact that she's a leader and she makes choices.
And a poor leader who didn't do the number one thing you need to do as leader, which is keep your caucus happy.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I would agree with your analysis that there hasn't been enough or enough time for there to be a norm. So I think that that statement by the authors of that is an overstatement of the situation. On the other hand, I'm going to say that when women leaders fail the expectation that is placed on them, that there is a quicker judgment. And I do think that that's a gender issue, but it's a double-edged sword. As a long-time, feminist arguing for more women in elected office and part of equal voice and all of that, I can't say that women will make a difference, a qualitative difference to the nature of debate and the type of leadership, the way Andrea and Kathleen have talked about their leadership styles. I can't say that and then on the other hand say if they don't live up to that expectation that it's sexist, that they got thrown out. We put ourselves forward in a sense to be hoisted on that petard by saying that we'll do politics differently, and if we don't, then we should be judged that way. But I do believe that there was a very quick judgment there. I also am disappointed in some of the personal decisions that she made and the things that she thought were defensible.
I think
that's not what I expected of her, not as a conservative, a liberal, or a New Democrat, but as a woman, premier.
I think there is a generosity when male politicians resign or step down that's not there when the same thing happens to women. You look at McGuinty, he resigns, and people start talking about whether or not he's going to run federally, right? Like it's a completely different
little bit different
standard.
situation, though. He resigned. Nobody saw that coming. He went on his own terms, although there might have been some indicators, vultures circling or whatever. But with Redford, it's a different situation. She was shoved. I mean, she was taken to the edge of the pit and asked whether she wanted to jump or be thrown.
Folks, we've got a few minutes left, and I just want to get your final wisdom on all of the talk around elections right now. We have a minority parliament. We have a budget coming up probably May 1st or May 8th. The NDP will have to make a decision, as they have for the last 2 times, on whether they want to support that budget or send us off to the polls. If you were advising Andrea Horwath, does she call you for advice, incidentally?
I'm not on the inside. I'm old, past history.
What would you tell her to do?
What would I tell her to do?
Yeah.
I think she has staked out some areas. In some ways, I've watched Andrea move to the retail politics and the politics of the pocketbook. And there are issues like transit and other things that I'm yearning to hear their position on. In all due time, I'm sure we will hear their position on that. On the other hand, it's left Kathleen out there as the premier to stake the turf on those areas, and it can't be wrapped around Andrea's neck. I mean, the premier will fall or not on that. I think at this point in time, my advice would be don't go for an election. I don't believe the public is ready for it, and I think that things will continue to unfold that should be seen, including some potentially positive steps that the NDP supports and have been part of their policy platform, like increased pension support, minimum wage, and other things like that.
Do you think that Tim Hudak can continue to embarrass the NDP into calling an election that they perhaps don't want to have?
No, I think he's going to continue to do that. I think that's a good play by him, and I think and twinning the 2 leaders together is a good thing for him. But I think the NDP leader will do what's best for her and her party, and that is.
What do you think that is?
Wait until her support increases even more, as it has over the last 3 years.
You think she can go higher, even before an election's called?
Absolutely.
Okay, Siri, last word to you.
Are you going to ask me a question?
Well, I was leaving it open, but I guess the assumption has been that the Liberals will here's what they've said. We're going to present a budget. We're not going to negotiate with the NDP as we have in years past. If they don't like it, let them vote it down. We're happy to go to the polls on that budget. I wonder if the events of the last 24 hours make that theory just a little less bullish now.
I don't know if it was ever that bullish to begin with. I think they're always, I said this the last time, you're constantly weighing the pros and the cons. One of the things that I find problematic about the constant minority state that we're in is that each party has to be hedging their bets like this, right? And I would love to see all of the parties really put on the table, this is what I believe on transit, on taxes, on the way we're going to make this province better. I would love for people to actually put down a budget and put down some ideas that clearly state a vision for this province. And I hope that's what the Premier does. I hope she stakes some territory and she makes some bold choices and she gives people the opportunity to decide what they think.
My thanks to all 3 of you for coming in tonight. Syria Grell, the former Deputy Communications Director for Premier Wynne, now at Pilot PMR. John McAtishan, former advisor to Mike Harris, now the Bradgate Research Group. Francis Lankin, the former NDP Cabinet Minister, now with a very long title, Corporate Director at the Institute of Corporate Directors and OLG. Thanks so much, everybody.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.